Everybody, welcome to the Sanjaya Lall Memorial Lecture with Professor Daron Acemoglu. I'm Professor Andrew Stephen. I'm the Deputy Dean for Faculty and Research here at the Side Business School, and it's an absolute pleasure to be hosting Daron in his time as the visiting professor, the Sanjaya Lall visiting professor here at Oxford this month. So I'm not going to take up too much time because we want to hear from Daron, and then we'll have a Q&A with the audience. But as I'm sure you're all well aware, Daron is a very, very, very highly accomplished, world-renowned academic in the field of economics. He is going to share some work from his book with us this evening, and then we'll have a discussion around that. Daron is the Institute Professor at the Department of Economics at MIT and the Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professor here in Oxford. And we're just, as I said, delighted to have him here. Just a little bit of background for those of you who aren't familiar with this visiting professorship, which has been running for about a decade. The Sanjaya Lall Visiting Professorship here in Oxford was created to honor the memory and academic legacy of Professor Sanjaya Lall. This distinguished scholarship scheme has run for actually, as I said, over a decade, and it's invited some of the most prestigious international economists here to Oxford, with Daron being the most recent honoree under this scheme. For those of you who don't know much about Professor Sanjaya Lall, just a bit about him and his career here as a development economist and professor of economics here at the University of Oxford. His research interests included the impact of foreign direct investment in developing countries, the economics of multinational corporations, and the development of technological capability and industrial competitiveness in developing countries. He's one of the world's preeminent development economists. Lall was also one of the founding editors of the Oxford Development Studies Journal, and also a senior economist at the World Bank. And so it's a real pleasure that we can honor his legacy with this visiting professorship that we're honoring tonight with Professor Daron Acemoglu. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Daron to come on up to the lectern and give us our talk. You saw the QR code there on the screen. Actually, if we can just quickly bring that back. In the Q&A part this evening, we'll have mics roaming around in the lecture theatre. But if you're watching online on the live stream, or you'd rather not hold a microphone and speak, but just put something online, then use that QR code, which will take you to a web page where you can submit your questions, and then I'll moderate the discussion with Daron and see the questions on an iPad when the time comes. All right, Daron, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and it's my true pleasure to be here. Thank you to the Said Business School for hosting me, and thank you to the Lall family for their great hospitality as well, and thank you to all of you for being here. And it's my pleasure to be at Oxford. It's also my pleasure to share some thoughts from my recent book with Simon Johnson, Power and Progress, Our 1,000-Year Struggle Over Technology and Prosperity. I think the title essentially frames the question that I want to talk about today, which is that we are in the middle of some pretty impressive changes in technology. From biotech to communication technologies, and especially most recently to breakthroughs in AI, there is a tremendous amount of excitement. But often underappreciated is how society adapts and works with new technologies, in particular in regards to the question of who will benefit from new technologies, who will control these new technologies. The emphasis on struggle is for a reason, because we think this is one of the most important axes of understanding the impact of technology over society and economy, especially during this transformative age, and it's not receiving its due attention. Why are we perhaps not worrying as much about who controls technology and what technology does, especially in terms of income distribution, winners and losers? And I think there are two sorts of reasons, especially looked at it from the other side of the Atlantic, where you see techno-optimism in the media, in policy circles, has been very, very strong, that somehow we will work out the rough edges of the adjustment process to new technology. And the second is actually, on both sides of the Atlantic, is related to the economic science, that there is a widespread belief in economics that while there are disruptive effects of technologies, there is a very powerful mechanism at work which will ultimately make sure that we will generally tend to benefit, all of us will generally tend to benefit from new technologies. And of course, since most of us actually earn our livings in the labor market, that mechanism has to go through the labor market. Simon and I call it the productivity bandwagon. It is a very, very widespread idea in economics, perhaps so widespread that it doesn't have a name, so we had to christen it. What does the productivity bandwagon say? Essentially, the argument is very simple, at least superficially, and I'm going to argue that it actually gains its simplicity from perhaps ignoring some important considerations. Technology improves, so our knowledge improves. So for example, we didn't know how to do large language models before, now we do. If we use that the right way, that's an if. There are technologies in the past, we haven't used it for improving productivity, but if we use it not the way that we use nuclear weapons or not the way that we used other things which have been deployed for destructive reasons, and in the case of AI, I think there are some questions, but it's not a crazy presumption, then that's going to improve productivity. Meaning we're going to be able to produce more goods and services or higher quality goods and services with the same amount of inputs, in particular with the same amount of labor. And then the presumption of the productivity bandwagon is that that will somehow translate to higher real wages, meaning that now workers are going to earn more and are going to have the capacity to purchase more goods and services. So we have now spread all these gains more widely in society. So why would that be the case? So if I write it this way, as I've done here on the left, it seems like reasonable, but if we dig into it, why would it be the case? So the reasoning goes something like this, and it's a little more subtle than perhaps that chart on the left might first suggest. The idea is that productivity increases, that makes employers want to hire more labor because now labor has become more productive. The given amount of labor can produce more goods and services. And if employers rush out to demand more labor, the market process, the competitive process is going to bid up wages. Now, once you start spelling it out this way, you'll realize that there are two presumptions here. One, which I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on, is that somehow an increase in productivity makes firms want to hire more labor. I'm going to actually question that. I'm going to question that because it's actually a fairly non-trivial step, and we don't want to be lulled into a presumption that's not really true and sounds true. So we're going to dig into that. But I'm going to start from the second presumption here on this slide and then come to that one in a second, which actually is a very important one, that the market process works without regard to the topics that other social sciences worry a lot about. For example, power. Who has power? Who has coercive capacity? Who has the ability to impose things on them? So it is a non-trivial step that if employers want more labor, that will immediately, automatically, without any barriers, translate into higher real wages, and therefore the shared prosperity step will be completed. Well, my argument is going to be throughout this talk that throughout history, and this history is really important here, I'll come back for the reasons why. Throughout history, there are instances where you see the productivity bandwagon at work. So it's not a crazy presumption. But there are also instances where it hasn't worked. And it hasn't worked for exactly these two steps that I have just outlined, breaking down. Either because power-related considerations have been important, or because productivity increases don't necessarily translate to employers wanting more labor. So let me start with the latter. So here is an illustration of two very transformative technologies. Okay, I'm not going to be in the business of what Silicon Valley tech leaders do. It's like AI is more important than fire. I'm not going to say AI is more important than less important, but these are pretty important new technologies. The one on the left is perhaps the most transformative breakthrough of the Middle Ages, where the Dark Ages, so-called because of cultural reasons, were not dark technologically. There were many, many, many innovations in the production process that really transformed agricultural production, but none was as important as this thing, which is windmills, that really tremendously increased the ability of people to use energy for a variety of tasks. The right one, the one on the right-hand side, is equally important, is Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which enabled the type of cotton that could be grown in the US South to be cleaned. Both of these technologies were truly revolutionary in terms of their economic consequences. They really changed the organization of production in many parts. The windmill in much of medieval Europe. The Eli Whitney's cotton gin, actually Eli Whitney was one of the people who invented the cotton gin. There were several others, but Eli Whitney gets the credit. The cotton gin completely transformed the US Southern economy. It was a complete backwater economically. It became the largest exporter of cotton in the world and engine of the British Industrial Revolution, which was mostly about cotton textile in the early phases. In both cases, and you won't find much of a productivity bandwagon. The medieval period, despite the series of innovations, including the windmill, did not see much improvements in the real living standards of the workers who were the farmers. And if you think about that for a few minutes, you'll realize why that's quite expected, actually, because much of the medieval economy was in a coercive environment. Workers were often in servile relations, or even if when they were not in servile relations, they had a lot of obligations to big landowners and other powerful actors, such as the church hierarchy. And when more labor was demanded, those obligations could be increased via the coercive power of the high aristocracy and the church hierarchy. And the evidence seems to suggest that productivity increased a lot, but a lot of it was captured by a very small fraction of the population, about 5% or so, who went around building wonderful monuments, such as the ones you see in Oxford. But people remained poor. The one on the right is even clearer to see. Who were the workers? They were the black enslaved workers. And of course, when Southern plantation owners decided, oh my God, now there is a great economic opportunity in the form of cotton plantations, they didn't tell the slaves, oh, well, how much more money should we give you? They told them, okay, fine, you're moving to the Mississippi Delta, the down deep south where conditions were much worse, long hours, much more coercive relations, and living standards of the slaves actually worsened. Now, you might think these two examples are non-representative because precisely they are non-industrial technologies, although the cotton gin is sort of semi-industrial or it's adjacent to industrial, and precisely because I have emphasized coercion. But coercion is just the tip of a broader iceberg, which is power. Power relations are as important in every relation, every production relation, not just in the medieval economy. But perhaps even more quintessential for understanding technology is the Industrial Revolution. After all, the reason why Simon Johnson and I put so much emphasis in the book on history is because my experience, I think Simon's experience also, is that for the last 15 years when I talked about robots or digital technologies or other things creating huge inequality, wage declines, and being misused, you would always get especially from journalists in the US and tech people, oh, you must be saying this time is different, because we know in history everything has worked out. Look at the British Industrial Revolution. Well, I don't know what British Industrial Revolution they were looking at, because the history is actually very different. The history of the British Industrial Revolution is not devoid of coercion. The factory system was a coercive system, at least in the early phases. But most importantly, it shows great parallels to the other two examples that I showed earlier on. The British Industrial Revolution, for all practical purposes, started sometime around 1740, 1750, when advanced machinery started being applied, developed and applied in the production process. And the evidence is that by and large, we don't see much improvement in the real earnings, inflation-adjusted, price-adjusted earnings of the working class for about 90 years, up to about 1840 or so. And the most dynamic sectors of the economy, for example, weaving, the cottons that were being, or cotton yarn that was being exported, or cotton that was being exported and turned into yarn by spinners, and then weavers were processing that, they actually, during the process of the early industrialization, saw their real earnings decline by about half. Moreover, the factory was indeed partly about control, and as a result, the factory was a very oppressive place, and the working hours of typical British worker increased by about 20%. So at an hourly basis, real wages probably declined for about a good 90 years. So the sort of productivity bandwagon saving us all, for AI, just wait for another 2 years, well, if the British Industrial Revolution is the example we have to learn from, doesn't look so good. So what happened in the British Industrial Revolution? Well, again, I mentioned the power issue was very important. That's why it's in the title of our book. But there's another aspect. British Industrial Revolution's early technologies were all centered on automation, meaning substitution of machinery for tasks previously performed by workers. And what's so interesting about automation is that this is a lot of what we're doing with digital technologies today, and at least one path of what we might be doing with AI. And B, it actually, if you think about it, starts questioning that other part of the causal chain, that productivity rises, and then as productivity rises, employers would like to hire more labor. In fact, the reason why handloom weavers did so well in terms of they were the labor aristocracy, because there was great demand for weaving skills. And why did their real incomes decline by half? Well, because once weaving was mechanized, automated, their skills were not necessary. So actually, the big step here doesn't follow. So if I wanted to put it in a slightly more wonkish terms, when people say productivity rises, and all economists, well, many economists and all journalists are guilty of this, because they're actually confusing two things. They're confusing average productivity, which is how much output is produced per worker, versus what economic theory tells us what firms value, which is the marginal productivity of workers, meaning what a worker contributes. And why these two notions could go very different ways? Well, I think the best way of understanding that is this story, which is supposed to be a humorous story, well, unless you're a worker, of course, which is it says, the factory of the future will have two employees, a man and a dog. The man is there to feed the dog, and the dog is there to make sure that the man doesn't touch the equipment. So, if indeed that is the future of the factory, well, it's not very humorous for the workers, but it will have huge average labor productivity. You'll have one worker, or perhaps two if you count the dog, and a huge amount of output. This amazing machinery is producing a lot. But the reason why this is a humorous story is that if the machinery gets better and you double output, of course firms are not going to rush out to hire more men and their dogs. The marginal productivity, the contribution of the worker is trivial. So if automation is the order of the day, It takes tasks away from workers to give it to capital. The reason why weaving machinery was so useful is because weavers were expensive. They were the labor aristocracy. You don't need the weavers anymore now. Machinery does it. That's productive. You produce more output. But it's just like the guy and his dog. They're not needed. So there are, therefore, two big steps here that we have to think about: the productivity bandwagon in the past and in the future. In the age of AI, if we are going to hope that somehow the market process, the automatic process, is going to get us shared prosperity, it must be through the productivity bandwagon or some institutional responses. I'll come back to them. And if it's going to be the productivity bandwagon, then we need those two steps to work out. Somehow new technologies will increase the marginal productivity of labor, and power issues are not going to make capital dominant over labor. These issues were, of course, very much alive and very much understood during the British Industrial Revolution. Jeremy Bentham came up with his panopticon, precisely arguing that this was an efficiency-enhancing technology, but many people understood right away that this was actually a technology of control. It was a way of taking power away from workers and giving it more to capital. And part of the reason why workers fared badly wasn't just working hours and low incomes, but because life expectancy fell as low as 30 to 30 years at birth in cities like Manchester and London. Why? Because they were shoved into cities with horrible working conditions, and nobody gave them public infrastructure, clean toilets, or any sort of amenities. So these were all about power. Power is going to be very important in the future, but this issue of automation is going to be very important as well. But of course, when people tell you, and I'll tell you that, we are, of course, today, in the year 2024, we are hugely fortunate that the British Industrial Revolution happened, 200 years ago, or 250 years ago, started. We are much healthier, we have much better health technologies, we have much better comfort, and we have much greater levels of real incomes. So what happened? Well, things changed after 1840. And how did they change? They changed because institutions changed, especially power relations with democracy and trade unions in Britain. Trade unions were very heavily prosecuted up to the last quarter of the 19th century. And the nature of technology changed. But let me actually stop talking about the British Industrial Revolution. That could get boring. So let me talk about the modern times. Let me talk about the modern times and make the case that actually all of these issues are not just hypothetical, theoretical things we have to sort of think about for historical nuance. This is real wages for 10 demographic groups in the United States. And it's for men and women, men here, women here, and different curves are for different education groups: workers without a high school degree, high school graduates, workers with associate degrees, just a college degree, and those with postgraduate degrees. Everything is normalized to zero, so you see the cumulative real wage changes. Now, these figures shows two very contrasting periods of economic growth in the West or in the United States. The other countries are, I'll show you a little bit on that. But this is the end of the period of shared prosperity that had started, arguably in the 40s, but certainly you see it very strongly in the 1950s. But in this data set I'm showing you from 1963 onwards, you see all these curves are actually on top of each other. You have real wage growth for all of 10 of these demographic groups are essentially parallel, which means their real wages are growing at the same rate, and they're growing very rapidly. How rapid? It's actually a mind-boggling 2.5% a year in real terms. That's faster than productivity growth. So labor was benefiting from productivity growth during this period as much as perhaps slightly more than capital. That was the central tenet of shared prosperity. So you see the kind of process that in the 19th century, in the early 20th century, was the basis of that period of shared prosperity. And you see its undoing. From around 1980, these curves are going in different directions, but more striking is that the real wages of many workers, actually about half of the US labor force, is actually declining as productivity is increasing. So this is a very jarring version of non-shared growth. So therefore, confronted with this picture, a natural instinct is to say, why was there this shared prosperity and why did it come apart? So let me try to answer that. But before doing that, let me say that this is not the same across countries, but it's not unique to the United States. So in particular, pretty much every industrialized nation is struggling with the same pattern. Inequality has increased in most countries. US was the leader of inequality and remains the leader of inequality. But many other countries have also undergone similar processes, and many countries have struggled with the same problem of stagnant or sometimes even declining, like in Germany or in the UK, real incomes of people at the bottom of the income distribution. So here, let me go from the British Industrial Revolution to the early 20th century industrialization and go to the iconic sector of the car manufacturing, because that was a leader in introducing machinery, and it was also a leader in illustrating the types of shared prosperity dynamics that I emphasized already. In particular, you see here a picture from the Ford Motor Factory from 1919. Henry Ford was at the very forefront of introducing mass production, which meant machinery. So he was doing the automation. He was introducing his factories were the first time when there were the gun armament producers and sewing machine producers that were doing the same thing. But he did it at a much bigger scale, introducing the interchangeable parts system, so it's a more standardized production. He introduced decentralized electrical machinery so that machines could work much better and much more efficiently. So he was very much in the business of automation. But also, what you see with Henry Ford's factory is that while doing that, he also introduced, and his engineers also introduced, a completely different way of doing work, much more technical work, much more engineering knowledge, both at the back office and on the front line. So no surprise that when you see pictures from Henry Ford's motor factory, you see workers doing new tasks, new activities, where their marginal productivity was really central for the production process. As a result of these tasks, as a tremendous amount of new machinery and investment was introduced in the auto industry, employment increased by tenfold. So this was employment growth together with lots of new machinery being introduced. But the second one was very much related to power. The auto industry wasn't just a leader in automation and new tasks, but it was also a leader in world labor organization. In a series of iconic events, labor organization became most powerful in the auto industry, and from there it spread to the rest of the manufacturing industry. There were a number of very important ones. This one is there was one in Ford Motor Factories. This is a slightly later one. This is called the sit-down strike, where workers sat down rather than doing the work, and the GM, General Motors, had to agree with better working conditions, more technical work, and higher wages. So therefore, my argument is that the reason why we had this type of growth, both in the first half of the 20th century and in the decades following World War II, is precisely because these two pillars of the productivity bandwagon, not just automate work, but create work for workers, and the power relations, at least giving some voice so that workers could not be forced to work at low wages, were both important. So why did then the shared prosperity come apart? Well, because those two pillars came apart. Here is how an auto factory looks like. Except for the color, this machinery is very similar to what Ford was doing. It's an automation machinery. During Ford's days, it was putting things together in very rudimentary way that started being mechanized. Here, it's painting, welding, as well as operation and assembly. But what's remarkable in this auto factory is that you don't see the workers doing the technical tasks. So many employers introduced the automated machinery, but they didn't go to the next step of introducing the new tasks. Hence, we took one more step towards that modern factory with the man and the dog. So technology became more biased towards labor, more substituting for labor. Now, Of course, the type of increase in inequality is an epochal event, has many causes, but automation is really at the heart of it, and that's what my work with Pasquale Restrepo has argued. So here is a summary of that using this chart, where what I'm doing is I'm looking at more detailed demographic groups distinguished not just by gender and education, but gender, education, ethnicity, and age. And I'm zeroing on that period from 1982 to the just before the COVID period. And on the vertical axis, I'm showing the cumulative change in the real wages. And you can see that many of these circles, actually very big circles here, meaning big demographic groups, are below the zero line. Those are the people who are losing out in terms of real incomes as the economy is growing in terms of productivity. And the new element here is the horizontal axis. That's my and Pasquale's estimate of how much automation has impacted that demographic group. It's roughly speaking the fraction of tasks that the relevant demographic group was performing in 1980 that have since been automated. And what you see is a very strong relationship. You know, if you want to understand why these groups are doing so badly, I think our evidence shows you cannot do that without seeing that these groups are the ones whose tasks have been automated. But power is also at the center of it. And power, I want to now argue, is really about two things in the modern world. It is about organization. So United Auto Workers sit-down strike was a step towards strengthening labor so that they took a slice from the productivity increases. But the iconic event of the 1980s, the labor relations, starts with the PETCO strike, Professional Air Traffic Controller strike of 1981, when Ronald Reagan, as the new president, fired all the professional air traffic controllers. And that was a signal to many other employers who similarly took a very harsh line against strikes. Strike activity declined, labor power declined, unionization started an accelerated decline after that point, although it was already declining because of the diminishing importance of manufacturing. But power, when I talk about it, is not just about unions. It's not, certainly today in the United States, it's not about coercion. You know, there's no slavery, nobody in servile relations, not many people anyway. But it is also about ideology. What sort of priorities powerful actors have. And the two bookends that determined how gains in manufacturing, how gains in industry got divided was this, but also the changing priorities and ideologies of businesses. You can call it ideology, you can call it something else. In the book, we call it vision because ideology sometimes has some bad connotations. But it was the changing emphasis among managers and among owners that good corporations were the lean corporations that cut labor costs, didn't share the benefits with workers because that would be waste and would reduce what the shareholders got. And the more you gave to shareholders, the more dynamic the corporations became, the more investments it led to, and so on and so forth. And of course, the symbol of that was this great economist, Milton Friedman. But Milton Friedman's most famous article wasn't one of those in scholarly journals, but it's something he wrote in the New York Times Magazine, where he said the only social responsibility of business is to look after its shareholders, cut costs, cut wages, that's what's good. And it was a rallying cry for many managers who, for a variety of reasons, partly unions, partly other considerations, norms, felt obliged that if they make more profits, if they export more, they'll share some of that with the workers. Well, Friedman was telling them, you have license, you don't have to do that. Who will stand up against them? Well, unions could have done, but unions were also in decline. So these two bookends meant that the power relations shifted against labor. So the reason why I went into some details on these topics is because I think to understand who will benefit from new technologies, it is really important to consider these two things that have been drivers of who gets the benefits in history, whether new technologies just automates or introduces new tasks and hence increases the marginal product of labor, and how we define power relations. But when we think about technologies, when I'm talking about here, technology has two parts. What businesses are doing, and that's what I put the emphasis on by saying Milton Friedman, This is what, people like Jack Welch, who were running these big businesses. But businesses, of course, can do with technology what the nature of technology or what the characteristics of the technology allow. And that is determined by what the tech sector is doing. And that's becoming even more important today with AI and advances in digital technologies. And you might think, if the world is just one of seamlessly working markets, all that's important is what's the profitable strategy. Or perhaps if you believe Sam Altman and Mark Zuckerberg, they are also altruistic. But actually, in the same way that ideology, vision, priorities matter, if you believe Friedman, you cut wages. If you believe in what people used to call welfare capitalism, you share the gains with the workers. Well, perhaps what the visions of what the tech leaders do matters as well. And in fact, the argument in the book, and the reason for why I am worried about the future, is that it's not just a problem of corporate America. It's even worse, a problem of tech America. And the problem of tech America, which decides, of course, the trajectory of technologies, not just for the US, but throughout the world, is that as a, call it ideology, call it vision, preoccupation, the whole tech industry has become completely focused on automation. Why? Well, I don't think you can understand that without going back to the origin stories of computer science and AI. It was this brilliant mathematician, Alan Turing, who founded in many ways the field of computer science, but he also had a very different way, according to, relative to people, to his contemporaries, of thinking about both the human mind and the machines. He said, his work was on computation. He said, the human mind is just a computing machine, and computers are computing machines, and we're going to build better and better computers, and ultimately the computers are going to be as good as the computing machine that's in your brain. So that framed the field of computer science as one in which you judge the quality of the machines by how much human parity they achieve, meaning how close they become to humans. And of course, if you do that, it creates a natural bias for automation. The more human-like it is, or the more it can take over human tasks, the better. And that became also the founding vision of the field of AI, where the field was defined, created in 1956. Before then, nobody talks, there's no term of artificial intelligence. These gentlemen here, who are also very famous, defined that field. And they declared their aim to be, we're going to reach the human brain and human capabilities in 6 months. Okay, perhaps a year. All right, we're a little bit optimistic. But this vision is completely dominant today in the tech world. Artificial general intelligence being its most recent offspring. But even before artificial general intelligence, a lot of software systems, a lot of production processes that were digitized were all about, can we get computers to do more of the tasks of humans? And that creates this bias towards automation. And if the tech sector has the bias from automation, what will corporate leaders do? So there is a nuts and bolts problem. If you want to build a better tool, you need both nuts and bolts. But if the nuts aren't there, nobody is producing the technologies that are going to be useful for humans. Bolts are useless. But if the bolts are not there, nobody wants to generate the nuts either. So if the corporate leaders are believed to be just in the business of cutting costs. Now, if I stopped at this slide, it would be very bleak. I'm saying, oh, well, ideology plus business models, they are condemning us to more and more automation and more lower wages. Well, actually, but from the very beginning, there was a very different view of what technologies are about. It was as early as Alan Turing that Norbert Wiener, another brilliant mathematician, now this time at MIT, was writing about humans and computers working together. And in the book, Simon Johnson and I call this machine usefulness to contrast it with the machine intelligence. And if you look at history of computers, many of the things that we completely depend on today, the computer mouse out of Douglas Engelbart, hyperlink, hypertext, menu-driven computers, the ARPANET and the internet JCR Licklider's work, they all came out of a very different vision where machines were not supposed to replace humans. There wasn't human parity obsession, but it was machines to be useful to humans. So the reason why I'm saying this is because AI actually increases the capabilities both for automation. If you want to try to replicate humans, large language models are your tool. But it also increases, amplifies the possibilities for providing better information to humans so that they can perform more complex tasks. They can make better decisions. So therefore, this is actually a contrast between what the tech industry is going to be about that will matter greatly, and choice is going to be all over it. Now, the problem is that it's actually even worse if you get too hung up with machine intelligence. Because what we will end up doing is that because you're so convinced that machines are better than humans, you're going to rush to automate a lot of tasks. And what the US evidence shows is that in almost every wave of technologies, automation disappointed in terms of productivity. So every wave of technology, mainframes, inventory systems, personal computers, software systems for office work, they all were introduced with great fanfare. Productivity is going to double. And in all cases, it was lackluster productivity. And the reason is quite obvious. If humans are not as bad as you think and machine intelligence is not so great, you're going to be over-automating or you're going to be excessively automating. But the problem is actually worse also because, again, I keep coming back. The factory system was automating, but it was also about control. But what is AI? AI is a control machine. AI is an information tool, and every information tool, just like Jeremy Bentham's panopticon, is also a tool for control. So these two may look a world apart. The social credit system for trains in China and Facebook. So some people will say, you know, social media democratization versus centralized control. But actually, there's more parallel between these two than meets the eye. Both of those are that one organization with its own ideology is centralizing information and it's deciding what you see. Here, it's telling you, well, you see only the posts that are approved, and we're going to incentivize that by giving you a higher credit if you give the right posts. And here you see what we decide you see for purposes of monetizing that with digital ads or whatever else values the people who are doing the content moderation in Facebook or Google have. So power, which I said was central, is also completely inseparable from how we use AI. So we're going to have these choices. Who is going to get more power with the use of AI? And whether we're going to use AI to increase the marginal productivity and the capabilities of workers, or we're going to try to sideline the workers. And history shows we have a lot of choices, and today we have a lot of choices. For every example, or okay, fine, every 10 examples of automation, I can find one good example where some company or some sector has used the same technologies for creating new tasks for workers. For every Facebook, Google, Chinese Communist Party, there is the system in Taiwan where they have used AI in order to make technology more pro-democratic. So there are choices. What choices are we going to make? Well, that depends on who's going to make the choices. I think if the choices are between Sam Altman and Elon Musk, I don't think we're going to get the right outcomes. So the history, again, this time is no different. History teaches us one thing. Democratic process is really important. So if the debate is just between Elon Musk and Sam Altman, they can go in the ring if they want. But that's not going to bring democracy. And if you don't bring democracy, I don't think you're going to have the type of broad set of voices that say, well, we should structure this technology both in terms of the production process and in terms of the relations of power, such that a broad cross-section of society, including the developing world, by the way, that always gets involved, that's ignored, that these people will benefit. So we need a democratic process. Where will that democratic process come from? Well, again, labor movements, but I'm not sure whether Amazon and Starbucks unionization is going to be the kind of model. So I think we need a different approach to labor movement and labor voice. Actually, there is some interesting changes in the United States taking place where union leaders over the last 2 years have become much more concerned about, can we make the labor movement be an input into the technology direction? So that's the thesis that I am defending. But it will also come from civil society activism. So Ralph Nader, before he became the punching bag for spoiling the 2000 election, was actually a very important leader for civil society because he was the face of the consumer protection movement that was so important in introducing all these pharmaceutical transport and other regulations. So that sort of civil society movement is going to be very important. And the issue is actually not new at all. In the first few years where personal computers were coming on board, there were people like this gentleman, Ted Nelson, who outlined a very different vision of personal computers. Ted Nelson and people like him thought that the problem with information was that companies like IBM were controlling it, and the personal computers were the tool that would enable the democratization of information, both in people's private lives and in the production process. But of course, who controlled the personal computers? It was, Microsoft and other companies that created large companies that created tools for other large companies. So the Ted Nelson hope never materialized. But I think perhaps in the age of AI, we can do better. And the last thing I'm going to show you is that this is not completely unprecedented either. So it's not a complete pipe dream to say civil society, perhaps government regulation, democratic input, could then shape the direction of technology in a more beneficial direction. Again, we could go back to the British Industrial Revolution, second phase of the British Industrial Revolution after 1840s, 1850s, but there's a more recent example, energy. The energy sector, okay, fine, we're not doing all that much in climate change, but climate change, we're probably going to exceed 2.5 degrees centigrade over pre-industrial times. But today, actually, the world is much better than it was 20 years ago, because 20 years ago, none of the renewable technologies were even close to being cost competitive. In electricity production, they were about 10 times as expensive. And starting in the late 2000s, there's a complete decline, and now for electricity production, onshore wind, offshore wind, and different types of solar technologies are all cost competitive with fossil fuels. How did that happen? It happened, first of all, because of innovation. There was a huge number of patents and great exploitation of economies of scale in solar panel production and some other tool production. Why did it happen? Well, because there was pressure from civil society. A few countries introduced carbon taxes. Some countries, including starting in California, introduced regulations that made fossil fuels less profitable. And many countries, including the US, started providing subsidies to the more socially beneficial direction of research, which means renewables rather than fossil fuels. So what happened in energy, I think, can happen in how we use AI. And I think the past shows that automatic hope that new technologies will naturally benefit democracy, will naturally benefit workers, will naturally benefit all of us, is a little bit too much wishful thinking. But the potential is there, and if we create the right power balance and the right direction for technology, we have more hope. Thank you.
Thank you, Daron. So now we're moving into the Q&A portion, and we've got about 20-25 minutes to hear from all of you and hear more from Daron. So as I mentioned at the start, if you want to post some questions essentially anonymously, you're very welcome to do so using that QR code from your phone. But we've also got microphones around the audience. So maybe we start with an audience question, if I can see any hands. Okay, so I don't know where the microphones are, though. So here we go. So let's start over here, because it's probably easiest for you to get to. and we'll go from there.
Hi, thanks very much. That was really insightful. I was wondering about power, not only in an ideological sense, but also in the sense of market power. and whether the emergence of new technologies and the rise in productivity may be associated with the emergence of superstar firms, and consequently concentrated labor markets may actually lead to a depression in wages. I wonder if you think that's a realistic concern and
Absolutely.
should be considered.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for that question. And in fact, there's a third reason why technological change may not generate prosperity for regular people or workers, and it is related to market power. So if you have a new when we are talking of prosperity here, we're talking of real wages. Wages divided by some sort of price index. So imagine we have a new technology, but at the same time it increases the market power of a few companies, so they start charging higher markups, higher prices. So then the price declines that would have led to the real wage increase would not happen. And I think that is a concern, and indeed, as you said, there are many sectors where we are seeing greater concentration. The reason why I have not emphasized it is because emphasizing 2 rather than 3 is a little simpler, but also because many of the tech sectors are not monetizing their products via higher prices. And that's part of the paradox of antitrust today. There are people like Lina Khan and Jonathan Cantor in the United States who are really worrying about these things, but there's a big barrier against them, which is the usual antitrust argument would be, well, you've come to corner the market, you're charging higher prices. Well, Facebook doesn't charge any prices. It just takes your data and monetizes it. Google doesn't charge any prices. Amazon actually, it charges prices, but oftentimes it cuts prices relative to competitors because they're monetizing it differently. They're also the venture capital-based model of grow very fast is creating a long time period in which these companies are not really charging big markups. So I think it's important, but that's why I haven't emphasized that as much. But on the other hand, I would say that business model of monetizing data actually really is pernicious because it closes the door, or it makes it harder for the types of tools that I was talking about that would make workers more productive. Why? Because if the main way of making money is collect data from people and monetize that through digital ads, then you don't put your energy into finding better ways of making workers more productive.
So let me come to a question that's related that I've got here, and although just to tee up the next question, hands up. Okay, maybe we'll take some, maybe down here next. But this is, I think, somewhat related. Someone on here is asking or suggesting that maybe that early on benefits of technology are more concentrated, but maybe later on, and they're suggesting maybe it's a few decades, but I don't know. There's a delay, and then that spreads. What do you think?
Well, that's a great question. It's a very, very important point. So the question is, obviously, the British Industrial Revolution narrative that I provided suggests that early on things didn't work out, and later they worked out. But I think the question is, was that automatic?
Yeah.
Or was that the result of some difficult choices, difficult institutional adjustments? So we can't know that. We don't have the counterfactual history. But my guess is that, A, if we did not create the trade unions, if the trade unions, they were persecuted as heavily in the beginning of the 20th century in the UK as they were in the beginning of the 19th century, if UK did not democratize, and if the emphasis remained on automation, it would have happened even more slowly. And 90 years is already pretty slow. That's 3 generations. Mm-hmm. So my argument is that we can do it much faster with the right technological choices and right institutional choices. So I wouldn't say it's automatic, but sure, there are many adjustments that do take place. Norms change, institutions change, technology changes, and there are market processes that work more slowly, absolutely. I think I'm not ruling those out, but I think the automatic is not the only order of the day here.
Okay. Question over here, please.
Sorry, thank you. Professor Acemoglu, it's more not question, but more like I wonder how this kind of British Revolution, Industrial Revolution situation is leading us to create a fear mongering of somebody or something stealing away our job. Like in the past, people were so afraid that their job is going to be taken away by a machine, and now it's people are afraid again that it's going to be taken away by the AI. My comment is, Professor, is that in the past, people have to use their muscle to work for the betterment of themselves. And then it evolves into the usage of brain. And maybe in the future, it's going to be involved into something else that is like perhaps we no longer need to be busy about doing something clerical, for example, that is going to be taken away by the AI. But then humanity in the future could be more focused on something that is more useful or more using the heart instead of the brain. If you get my point, my sense.
Yeah, I get your point, but I partially disagree. First of all, I mean, I think there's a thin line separating concerns and fear-mongering. So I would say concerns are different than fear-mongering if we are also seeing a path that would avoid those concerns. So there have been, indeed, you are 100% right, periodic concerns about jobs disappearing, but they haven't all been wrong. Some of them have been right, some of them have been wrong. So the evidence that I did not show, but it's my work with Pascual Restrepo, for example, when we looked at the introduction of robots, which was the previous big technology that people were very afraid of. Well, they were right to be afraid of in the United States. We find that for every one robot, there were 6 jobs that were destroyed, and net. And in local labor markets where robots were introduced, there were significantly lower wages, especially for workers who were engaged in manual tasks. But it's not inevitable. So in Germany, when they introduced robots, what they did at the same time, especially in companies which had unions and work councils, is that they also at the same time upgraded the work jobs. So the workers who used to do, say, painting or welding now became technical workers, and as a result, the effects were not as negative. So they were right, workers were right to be concerned, but there was another option. Now, I think in my mind, the fear-mongering is when we're talking of artificial general intelligence and killer robots. That's fear-mongering because it doesn't give us much choice, and it's a very false dichotomy. Either robots are either artificial intelligence is going to be great for us or it's going to kill us all. So I think the issue is in the middle. It's going to do neither, but it's how we actually deal with it. And you are absolutely right. There was a hope early on that machines would take manual works, manual jobs, heavy jobs, and they will leave us with more enjoyable, more satisfying, and less dangerous jobs. And some of that has happened in workplaces where robots have been introduced in the US and in Europe. Yes, in the US, I told you jobs have disappeared, but remaining jobs became safer. And we definitely don't want to go to the time where people carry things by hands when there are cranes and automated machinery for carrying. But the problem with AI is actually that it's not taking the jobs that are more mundane. If you look at what are the jobs that are affected by AI, the safest jobs are custodial, protective services, construction workers. It's the office jobs. It's some jobs that are semi-creative that could be taken away by AI if we just go down the automation path. So it's actually, and then, yeah, of course, perhaps in 100 years' time, we can have other adjustments, but again, it's the automatic versus non-automatic issue.
So I'll come to another poster question, really getting, I think, at inequality around access to AI. And so, we might all be sitting here and it's great. We can access ChatGPT or Copilot or Claude or Gemini or whatever it is for whatever purpose. Great. But that's not true everywhere around the world. So the question is, how will the introduction of AI influence the economic landscape of regions with limited technological access, particularly in contrast to the advancements seen in more affluent nations?
Absolutely, that's very important, and that's the thing I very briefly hinted at, which is what about the developing world? The developing world doesn't have access. Even if they have access, the global division of labor is going to change in a massive way. What are the, look at the globalization experience of the 18th century. India became hugely deindustrialized. That was like the place that was most advanced in textiles. Globalization became very damaging to India. Well, look at the globalization in the 1960s, 1970s. Well, South Korea, Taiwan, later China did very well under globalization. Why? Globalization created opportunities that they didn't have. In particular, it enabled them to specialize in things like textiles or furniture or toys that were low skill, low technology sectors that could be an engine of growth. Well, the question is AI going to create that sort of thing? And it doesn't seem like that. Quite the opposite. Some of the services that could be done in the developing world would actually be completely reshored with AI. So I think the implications are going to be more complex. But even having access to AI and knowing how to use it may not be enough. So imagine that we have, let me give you an example from journalism. So we have 100,000 journalists, say, in the United States. That's not quite that many, but okay. But we teach all of them to be very good at prompt engineering. But if AI goes in the automation direction and all that it can do for journalists is that more of their tasks can be completed, it doesn't matter whether you're very good at prompt engineering. What's going to happen is that we're not going to need 100,000, but we're going to need not only 20,000 journalists. So journalists are not going to fare very well. What would it take for them to fare better? Well, if instead of just automating, if we create AI, if we develop AI such that we can actually provide better information to journalists so that they can do more sophisticated research. So that's really the nature of technology. Whether you know how to use the technology or not is important, but it's not just the only determining factor.
Okay, another question from the room. How about we go...
I already have a microphone.
Oh, okay. Whoever's got a microphone, I can't see where you are.
Hi.
Oh, there you are. Fantastic.
Hi, my name's Julia. I'm an undergraduate here studying economics. My question relates to a different type of inequality. You show a graph with the divergence in real wages related to education, and noticeably there's less divergence among women. Linking that in with what you say about task replacement, is the implication that tasks typically performed by women are being replaced to a lesser extent, or how would you explain that divergence?
Absolutely. So essentially 100%, you're very, very perceptive that if you look at the period that I focused on, which is where some office work was being automated with software system, but a lot of automation was taking place for blue-collar jobs, that was on more, the onus was heavier on men. And in fact, you're 100% right. Pretty much every dimension of inequality increase except by gender. The gender inequality narrowed for other reasons, but the automation of male jobs, especially male jobs that paid high wages, helped. But here is the bad news. I have recently done the study of AI and who might be, it's very, speculative because it hasn't happened yet, it's the future. But if you look at the types of jobs that generative AI can perform, they're more female jobs. So it looks like now generative AI might act towards increasing the gender gap rather than the earlier automation that might have a little bit closed it.
Okay, how about another one from the room? I don't know, maybe go to Pinar.
Thank you, and please excuse my voice, it's about to be gone. But I wanted to ask you about that future where you have that one person who's watching the dog, and you don't have all these other workers. How does the notion of a universal basic wage fit into that, and what will be differences between countries?
Yeah, so excellent question, and thank you for bringing it up. Because there's like a big gaping hole in what I talked about, which is, okay, fine, why do we need wages to create shared prosperity? Let Elon Musk earn everything. Okay, Sam Altman earns some too. And then we redistribute all of it. And then, you can choose your favorite method of redistribution. It could be UBI, it could be something else. But we have a huge level of inequality, and then we just use the fiscal system to redistribute it. What's wrong with that? Well, I would say there are three things wrong with that. First of all, I'm suggesting an alternative, which is redirecting technology so that we generate more equal distribution of income. So saying that we're going to go to UBI is defeatist, in my opinion, because it says we can't do anything else. There is nothing we can do to change technology, or technology is unchangeable. The future is one of only Elon Musk, Sam Altman, and Mark Zuckerberg making money. We're going to be all dispensable. Well, that's a sad type of defeatism. Second, I don't think the political economy of it doesn't work. I haven't seen many billionaires who are willingly giving their money today. I mean, the only thing that they are willing to do is charity, which often is a way of further boosting their prestige and power. So what makes you think that tomorrow suddenly they'll say, we earn everything, but we're going to distribute the rest of it? Well, perhaps if they're really worried about a revolution, perhaps, but it's not going to be that easy. But the third one is the one that would really worry me, and that, again, takes us from the realm of pure economics to more broader social considerations. If we create a world, or if we are in a world in which, say, 5% of the population does the earnings, the remaining 95% is completely useless. They don't have any jobs. They can't do anything. They just live off the crumbs. That's going to be a hugely hierarchical, hugely dystopian world with status gaps that are just massive, even relative to what we are seeing today. So I don't think that's going to be a happy world. So yes, if indeed, either because I'm wrong and it's inevitable that we go to massive inequality, or it's not inevitable but we don't make the right policy choices, yes, of course, we have to create some sort of way of redistributing them, but hopefully it doesn't come to that. Thank you for raising that.
Let's do another one from the room. Okay, can we go down the front here, please? I think both of you had your hand up, so you can fight it out. It's up to you.
Thank you. Thank you for your talk. I want to ask that, as you have quoted in your talk, Milton Friedman clearly thinks that market mechanism is a better arbitrator of power balance and stuff than political channels. But also, I feel that there are also problems with politics because market mechanism, because clearly economic power is very proximate to political power. And as we see more and more tech giants rising, maybe the legislations that are supposed to curb their power are receive the most influence from them. So who do you think is the better arbitrator of this power balance?
Well, I don't think there is a perfect arbitrator. Absolutely. I think there's sometimes in discussions and sometimes in economics debates, there is this sort of rhetoric that somehow politics is something that comes in addition, like on top, like things are working well if only politics wasn't part of it. And I think that's not the right way to think about it. Politics is with us all the time. Politics, power relations are always there in workplaces, in markets, in social situations. And it is a balance between the market and politics. And exactly like you said, if somebody has a lot of economic power, they will tend to have a lot of political power. So saying, oh, the market's going to sort out things if we just leave politics out is a fantasy. But the political process is very unequal, sometimes much more unequal than the economic process. So that's why we have to try to build the right sort of institutions and norms to balance them up, but it's not going to be perfect. And when unions were strong, they helped curb some abuses of workers, but then the workers sometimes had too much power in some workplaces, and they used that power incorrectly or badly, like resisting technological change. In the British printing industry, unions resisted printing machines, making the industry fall behind 20 years. So any group having too much power is going to be a recipe for certain types of problematic outcomes. So some sort of balance, if we can achieve it, would be the thing to strive for.
Okay, so let me go with another question that somebody's put online here. This is getting to what you were talking about before around essentially, one view of AI is substituting humans versus the other one complementing or augmenting. And the question is really just about, well, what skills do you think we will see complemented versus substituted by AI? And I guess really they're getting at is how do we then think about that in the context of directing or redirecting technological development into sort of the right way, shall we say, as opposed to the other
Perfect.
way?
That's a great question. But my answer is it will depend. Because it really depends on how we develop AI. So here is one skill that I would love to see as complement to AI. Electricians. So in the United Kingdom, in the US, we have a shortage of electricians that's going to get only worse with the electrification of the grid. What is the problem? The problem is we're not training enough electricians, and the electricians are required to deal with more and more complex problems. So is that a substitute or complements to AI? Well, you can say, well, we can try to automate these jobs, in which case they would be substitutes. But actually the better way would be use AI to provide better information and better training opportunities so that they can upgrade their skills, they can recognize problems and diagnose problems and perform more sophisticated tasks, in which case AI would be a complement to electricians. Same thing for plumbers, same thing to other manual workers. So I think there's a lot of scope for creating those complementarities, but it would require the technology to change in that direction.
Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. We'll take that from the room. So let's go in the very back, because I've had a front bias here. So let's go up the back there. And apologies to the microphone people having to walk up the stairs.
Very interesting. Thank you for your time. I'm studying artificial intelligence for business here. The question is, you're talking about the capabilities that are complementing humans through AI and the ones that replace. And you talk about powers, corporate powers, industrial powers. I think there is a double narrative at the same time happening, because when you see yesterday the LinkedIn and Microsoft work report telling that 75% of white collars are using AI in the United States, but at the same time, 2/3 of the companies in the United States are developing projects to replace some of their workforce through AI. My question is, in this double narrative, from your point of view, which one is more realistic? The AI complementing capabilities of humans, or the companies making replacements?
Well, that's a great question, and that's the key question. And I don't think I can make a forecast, because it's not like the weather. It's something we're going to choose. So if Microsoft and OpenAI and Google decide it's substituting for workers, then we're going to end up with substituting for workers, unless some other companies come up. So their choices are going to matter. But also, I think hype about AI is not helping. And the number that you just quoted is pure hype. You know, very few workers right now are really using AI in the United States. So you can count many workers using AI, because if you're using Microsoft Word has a Copilot, the Copilot has AI in it, so that you can say you do. But I arranged with my collaborators, big survey for all of businesses in the United States through the Census Bureau. And in 2020, 1.5% of US businesses had any investment in AI. Okay, perhaps it has increased a little bit in the last 3 years, but it's still very, very much embryonic. So it's all to play for. It's going to be the next decade or so where we're going to see how much AI, what type of AI, and who's going to benefit from it. So I think being realistic about where we are and what we can do is a very important part of it. Thank you.
Okay, and that's a really good point to end on. So I want to say a massive thank you to Daron for joining us and giving us your thoughts, and thank you to all of you for coming along as well. Thank you.